As Trump returns is the biggest talking point for the world as investors gear up for the uncertainty and the rising threat of tariff wars. But BCA Research Marco Papic believes that Trump will go easy on his promises, expects the dollar to peak out soon. Here's an excerpt of the chat.
Expectation of Fed rate cuts have been completely taken out of the market, except for one in October. And I think that growth will not surprise to the upside. I think the growth will surprise to the downside. And so the Fed will end up having to cut more than once in 2025.
You said more than once, but how much would be 2 or 3 or more than that also? And what is your assessment on bond yield?
Yeah, so I don't want to guess how many. I think saying that there's going to be more than once is more than enough for investors to realize that the dollar is probably too strong, and that the 10-year yield probably has more upside, but eventually it will peak and start coming down. So I think that, and also, labor data has been very strong. However, labor data is basically a coincident indicator. Labor data would be like trying to predict tomorrow's weather by looking outside your window. It's not very useful. And so I do think that looking forward, what I'm looking at is less fiscal support for the economy. And the fact that bond yields have risen today, that will hurt growth over the next 2 quarters and expectations of growth. So yes, I do think the Fed will cut more. Now, does that mean that I expect a recession? I'm open to that possibility, but I'm not in the recession camp, at least not yet. And so I think that the Fed will cut more because it will face, lower inflation and lower growth, but not necessarily cut so much that it's a panic-induced cutting cycle that we would be familiar with in a recession.
Right. The other thing I wanted to also talk about is, post-Trump winning elections, the dollar index, that's shot up about almost 6%. Where do you see it heading from here and the kind of impact that it's having already on emerging market currencies?
So I think the dollar has more upside. And one of the reasons is that I think that in the short term, over the next 3 months, most investors do expect fiscal policy to be very stimulative, and they expect tariffs. And I think that there will even be a surprise on the tariffs. We'll have higher tariffs than even what most expect. So it's dangerous to try to catch the top in the dollar. Dollar also is famously a momentum currency. It takes a lot to kind of slow it down. So because of that, I think for the next 3 months, there's still more upside to the dollar. But then at some point in Q2, I think that investors will realize that their expectations of US growth outperformance relative to the rest of the world is built on a house of cards that stands on fiscal policy that will be significantly different. And then finally, I think they will realize that the tariff expectations are going to basically abate as we realize that President Trump is okay cutting deals on trade. Those two things will combine to give us relief, but probably in the back end of 2025. So Q1, more upside to the dollar. Q2, maybe some relief. Q3, Q4, a lot more relief. And I think we will end the year at a lower level on the DXY than we are today.
Right. So, Marco, what could be the level for the DXY till about your end? Where is it that you see it settling?
I mean, I think it's very difficult to forecast that. I think the DXY is going to come down. I think given that there's more upside, maybe 110, 111, it's difficult to see it dip below 100 in 1 year. That would mean more than a 10% decline in 12 months. So I would say probably somewhere between 100 and 105 by the end of the year.
Okay, 100 and 105, so at least a bit of a cool off from the levels of 110 that we have seen recently. But what's the expectation on crude? Because while on one hand the supply side issues are abating a bit, especially with the Middle East tension simmering off, what's the demand side looking like? Because that's been the worrying point. So given this, what's the outlook on crude?
On oil, the outlook on oil is, I think in the near term, again, very similar to everything else I'm saying. In the near term, there's more upside, there's more volatility, there's more risk, both because of the sanctions that have been imposed in Russia, but also because US is highly likely to be very aggressive in its negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. And so